Well, sort of concurrent with our series that we've been walking through in 1 Peter, we've been stopping in at the book of Ecclesiastes from time to time. Like I mentioned in part 1, we're taking more of a thematic approach. So we'll be taking Ecclesiastes 3 as a sort of launch pad this morning, as one of the main texts in Ecclesiastes that talks about time and the providence of God. But that'll form sort of a starting point, and we'll just pull the theme right through the book and see what the whole book has to say about this theme, about these ideas. Along the way, as we've been dipping into the book of Ecclesiastes, I've tried to do a little bit of myth busting. So you might have heard Ecclesiastes, along with Job and the book of Proverbs especially, spoken about as the wisdom literature of the Bible. I said that that's not the most helpful way of thinking about it. While these books do have important things to say about wisdom, that they also speak about a whole lot of other topics, and by grouping them together in this wisdom literature category, we risk both brushing over those, but also losing sight of the fact that these books are also tightly woven into the story of Israel and God's dealings with his people. Quite often when we group them together in this wisdom literature category, they become general musings on life, rather than specifically about God's dealings with his people. I also suggested that although a lot of people through the centuries have thought of Ecclesiastes as being written by King Solomon, that probably isn't true either. It isn't hard to see why people would think that, but it's more likely that it was written sometime in the 3rd century BCE by somebody who was living in Jerusalem. They were caught in the crossfire between the Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south. I think it's that way around. I keep forgetting, and I keep trying to find ways of remembering it, and then I forget those things too. But I think it's the Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south, and they're at war with each other, trying to gain control over the region. And there they are, the Jews sitting in Jerusalem, caught in the crossfire. Things were really hard for them, and that's the sort of picture that we should have in mind as the sort of backdrop to Ecclesiastes. And with that backdrop, you can sort of see why he might say something like meaningless, or we thought together in part 1 about hevel. That things are elusive, ungraspable, difficult to make sense of, difficult to cope with. Anyway, the book strongly implies Solomon, even if it's not written by him, offering a sort of impersonation of Solomon. We're imagining that it's Solomon speaking, that it's Solomon recounting his experiences of the world that God has ordered, as probably the most qualified to do so. But the plot thickens. The way the teacher frames his whole experiment, his whole way of looking at the universe in terms of wisdom, definitely puts Solomon center stage as the main king that Ecclesiastes has in mind. But he isn't the only king Ecclesiastes has in mind. In chapter 2, the teacher talks about having silver and gold, flocks, herds, oxen. He enjoys fine wines and all sorts of other things, a lot like Solomon, but also like Hezekiah. So in 2 Chronicles 32, we read, Hezekiah had very great wealth and honor, and he made treasuries for his silver and gold, and his precious stones, spices, shields, and all kinds of valuables. He also made buildings to store up the harvest of grain, and new wine, and olive oil. He made stalls for various kinds of cattle, and pens for the flocks. He built villages and acquired great numbers of flocks and herds, for God had given him great riches. It was Hezekiah who blocked up the upper outlet of the Gihon spring and channeled the water down into the west side of the city of David. A lot like Solomon, the teacher takes on all these building projects in the first few chapters of Ecclesiastes, but then so did Rehoboam and Jehoshaphat and Uzziah. A lot like Solomon, the teacher accumulates riches, but then we see that also with Hezekiah and David and Asa and Uzziah. The teacher has male and female singers. He's got his own personal choir. And Solomon certainly is said to have musical interests. He's written a whole lot of songs. But then so did David, who's actually quite famous for it. And when Josiah died, he had male and female singers lamenting his passing. So what we have in Ecclesiastes then is not just the memoirs of one particular king, but a composite portrait of the kings of Israel, all summed up into one. Ecclesiastes, in a sense, is the life and times of Israel and her kings. So what does this have to do with time and God's providence? That's what we're going to be looking at this morning. On its own, not a hang of a lot. But it does set the stage for the poem that we're going to be looking at together in just a moment in Ecclesiastes 3. So we're going to start by thinking together about our times and seasons. Our times and seasons, looking at things from a human perspective, from our point of view. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the skies, Ecclesiastes 3:1. Time for birth, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, time for this, time for that, time for one thing, time for the other thing. On a first look, it's just the various stages of life. Some have thought that this is talking about life's opportune moments. So there's a right time for things and a wrong time for things. And the best way to go about life is to work out, well, what's the best thing right now? After all, even the right thing at the wrong time becomes the wrong thing. And that's true. But that's probably not what Ecclesiastes 3 is all about. It's more, this is how things are, not this is how things should be. Just a statement of the various seasons that we go through. But when we read it in light of what we saw just a moment ago, that Ecclesiastes is, in some sense, just recounting the life and times of the nation of Israel and her kings. A slightly different story begins to emerge, or a slightly fuller story, rather. There's a time to plant and a time to uproot, which calls to mind the way that the nation of Israel was planted in the covenant that was made with King David, and uprooted as they flouted that covenant and were sent into exile. There's a time to kill and a time to heal, calling to mind the prophecies in Ezekiel where the people are essentially slain as they're dragged through into exile. But God says to Ezekiel that he'll breathe new life into his people. And in Hosea, it says that the people are invited to return to the Lord because although he has torn us to pieces, he will heal us. Though he has injured us, he will bind up our wounds. There's a time to tear down and a time to build up, calling to mind the destruction of the temple. But in Ezra and Nehemiah and the prophets that were around that time of it being rebuilt, and the hope that God would return to dwell among them once more. There's a time to seek and a time to lose, calling to mind the leadership of Jerusalem, who in Ezekiel's time had led the people astray and are described as shepherds who have lost their sheep. But Ezekiel goes on to talk about the promised shepherd from the line of David, who will gather the flock back, who will seek them out and make things right. The writer of Ecclesiastes takes his readers through these different seasons of prosperity, seasons of brokenness and loss, seasons of peace, seasons of war, the joy of living in the land in covenant relationship with God. But then also the pain of exile and being torn out of the land and torn away from living in the presence of God. And taking a step back, looking at the sweep of these seasons, he looks at all this, the positive and the negative, and just puts a big question mark over it. There have been times and seasons where things have gone well. And just a little while before the 3rd century, it looked like things were on the rise. It looked like things might be coming back together. But looking at what's going on in his own time, he casts his eye over the life and times of the nation of Israel and just puts this big question mark over it. Can't help but ask, where are those times? Where is that prosperity? What did it look like to live in covenant relationship with God? It feels like they're stuck in a loop. 1 verse 9, there's nothing new under the sun. And in the verses before that, there's just this relentless perpetuity. The sun rises, sets. The wind keeps turning on its course. The rivers keep flowing, but the sea is never full. On and on. It never stops. It just keeps going and going and going. Nothing seems to be changing. But just because nothing's changing, it doesn't mean that we know what's going to happen next. So in 8 verse 5, we read, "Whoever obeys the king's command will come to no harm, and the wise heart will know the proper time and procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a person may be weighed down by misery. But since no one knows the future, who can tell someone else what is to come? As one has power over the wind to contain it, as no one has power over the wind to contain it, so no one has power over the time of their death." So it seems the best advice, with that there in the backdrop, the best advice that Ecclesiastes can give us is to enjoy life and the good things that it offers while you can. Carpe diem. Seize the day. 9 verse 7, enjoy a drink and a good meal. Put some product in your hair. 11 verse 8, however many years anyone may live, let them enjoy them all. But remember the days of darkness, for there will be many. Everything to come is hevel, which the NIV has as meaningless. You might want to have another listen to part 1 of our look at Ecclesiastes, where we thought a little bit more about that. Everything's ungraspable. It's elusive. Enjoy your youth. Enjoy the days you have. And he goes on in chapter 12 to paint this bleak picture of what comes next. The lights grow dim, the doors close, and the grasshopper no longer jumps but just drags himself along the ground. The music fades, the curtains come down, and we all go to our eternal home. Really the sort of stuff that warms your soul, right? It's a bleak picture. It's worth bearing in mind that he says this in a context. Things are looking pretty bleak for the people of God living in Jerusalem. They're caught in the crossfire between 2 warring nations, and things aren't exactly going well for them. But even so, it's a sobering thought. Life ends. We're confronted with death. We're confronted with death of the people we know, the people we love. And at some point, we've got to face up to the fact that we too are going to die. Confronted with this right there in the front of his vision, the teacher says at the start of chapter 12, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Take note of what he's doing and respond appropriately. We'll come back to our response in a moment, but let's just ask first, what is it that God is doing? What do things look like from God's perspective? So the second thing that I want to look at this morning is God's actions and reasons. We thought about our times and seasons. Let's think about God's actions and reasons. When we take a step back, what we see is that through every time and season, everything that we experience, God is in control of it. Now, it's worth saying that the writer of Ecclesiastes just assumes this. He just takes it for granted. He has other questions about God's providence, which we'll come to in a second, but he never doubts that God is in control. If you do, feel free to grab me afterwards. Feel free to talk to me, and we can hash it out. But the teacher just assumes it. He just assumes that God is in control. So for the time being, so will we. 3 verse 10, which is actually echoing Ecclesiastes 1:13. The teacher says, I have seen the burden that... Oh, hello. And God said, let there be light. I have seen the burden that God has laid on the human race, that God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time, and he has set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. He's given us a sense of something bigger, some bigger plan, some bigger perspective that we fit into, but he hasn't made it clear where exactly it is that we fit in. There's this bigger picture, but it's not always clear where we fit into that bigger picture. We see a similar assessment at the end of chapter 8. When I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe the labor that is done on earth, people getting no sleep day or night, then I saw all that God has done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all their efforts to search it out, no one can discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim they know, they can't really comprehend it. At no point does the teacher doubt that God is in control. But that's exactly the problem. He's right in the thick of a situation that's full of stress and anxiety and trauma and just this overwhelming uncertainty about what God might be doing through it all. And maybe that's you. Maybe that's how you feel. That you're right there in the thick of it. You're right there in the fog, and you're feeling, God, I know you're in control, but right now I have no idea what you're doing, and that's terrifying. One commentator sums it up this way. In his BC world, his before Christ world, the teacher felt lost and trapped. He found God's sovereignty over history overwhelming. When coupled with his inability to deduce what God was doing in history, it produced a disturbing sense of disorientation. This wasn't simply epistemic angst at being able to figure out a mental puzzle, but a deep-seated fear of being feebly small beneath a colossal God of unknowable potency. The deeper the teacher investigated the meaning of life and God's involvement with Israel through the ages, the weaker he found humanity, the scarier and more puzzling he found God. But it's worth saying what I said at the end of part 1. It's worth saying again that this isn't where the book of Ecclesiastes leaves us. And this certainly isn't where God leaves us. So as we come to the end of our time this morning, I want to think together about time brought to completion. As confusing as it might be, as disconcerting it might be, in the midst of our pain, our distress, the fact that God is sovereign, the fact that he is completely in control should actually be a great comfort. We can wade through it all knowing that God's plan for his people and his plan for the world is set. It's already been decided. It's already in motion. And he's told us what that plan is. So in Ephesians 1, God has now revealed to us his mysterious will regarding Christ, which is to fulfill his own good plan. And this is the plan. At the right time, he will bring everything together under the authority of Christ, everything in heaven and on earth. Furthermore, because we are united with Christ, we have received an inheritance from God, for he chose us in advance and he makes everything work according to his plan. He makes everything work according to his plan. To be sure, that won't answer every question, that won't explain every moment, and we won't always be able to see how this particular circumstance or experience fits into the bigger picture. There will still be moments where we'll cry out to God and say with the teacher in Ecclesiastes, I know you're in control, I know you're bringing your plans to completion. I know that you're working everything for my ultimate good, but I have no idea what you're doing, and I don't see how it fits into your plan. And he wants to hear our cries. He wants us to cast our anxiety onto him because he cares for us, because he loves us. But without discounting that, without being real with our uncertainty or distress, And I think we can be real with our uncertainty and our distress. He also calls us to trust him through it. Often it's the refining process that we can only see in hindsight. I don't think it's always helpful to pause in the middle of our pain, in the middle of our anxiety, and think, now what is the lesson that God wants me to learn? Sometimes it is, but sometimes we can't find the answer until we're out on the other side, until we've been through it all and we've got the perspective of looking at it in hindsight. But even in those times, even when we don't know what's going on, God calls us to trust him, because he does. And that is at least one aspect of what we see in Ecclesiastes 3. We might have no idea what God has done from beginning to end, verse 11. And verse 15, that God acts such that people will fear him. That's the whole duty of humanity, to fear God and to keep his commandments, we're told in 12 verse 13. Part of that might be terror, just plain and simple. Part of that might be that we don't know what's going on and that we're scared. But that isn't the only side to it. With fear also comes a sense of trust. Proverbs says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And Deuteronomy 10, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear him? It can be a scary thing to come to a point where all we can do is trust God, is to hand it over and say, you know what you're doing, and I'll let you take care of it. It's a scary thing to do, but it's often in those moments when we come to God in humility with nothing in our hands, but the full dependence that we can cast on him. It's often in those moments that he'll pull us closer to himself.